Welcome to our session, De-risking and Scaling Up Renewable Energy through Market-Based Policies, examples from the EU and around the world. I want to thank the European Pavilion and COP26 for inviting us today at this session. This is a session by the research project AURIS, which is funded by the European Union. Today we have a really interesting panel of practitioners and experts with us. I'm Fabian Wiegand, the moderator today, together with Anna Amazo, who's online, and Augustin from Guidehouse. Also the research coordinator, Vasily, from Fraunhofer EASY is joining. And here we have Sarah Lawson from USAID, who's providing a video statement. Adil Hanif from EBRD. Diala Havila from the International Renewable Energy Agency. Naida Tasso from the Energy Community. And Pierre Riek cannot join unfortunately today because he had to call in sick on a short notice, but he will listen in. We also have Devin Swayze here, who will provide from a practitioner's corporate view the newest trends in the fields of corporate procurement and renewable energy technologies. Let's start with a brief presentation on the key findings of our AURIS project. So we will start today with a brief outline on why we are having this panel of COP26. It is important because we see that with this higher ambitions for climate action and for renewable energy, there are new questions on how we can achieve these goals the most affordable way, how we can make sure that renewable energy plans, climate plans, and procurement plans are more aligned, and how we can make sure that the power we procure is also easily integrated into the system. For all of this, we see that renewable energy auctions are becoming a more important trend. I will first, however, start with a brief introduction of the AURIS-2 research project, and for this I will hand over to Vasily, who's joining us virtually from Fraunhofer EASY. Vasilios?
Yeah.
Oh, he's there. Perfect.
Thank you, Fabian. Thank you very much for the brief introduction. My name is Vasilios Anatolitis from Fraunhofer ISI in Germany. I'm the project coordinator of the AURIS-2 project. And first of all, thank you very much to the EU Pavilion for hosting the side event. Thank you very much to all the panelists. Thank you very much, of course, to our partners from Guidehouse and Fabian and Anna for moderating this event. And of course, a big thank you to all the viewers at Glasgow and of course online. So very briefly, some words before we start with the actual event on our research project. AURIS-2 means auctions for the renewable energy support. So we are an EU-funded Horizon 2020 project, and we actually look into the design of auctions. We try to research how policymakers can design them in the most efficient and effective way. Furthermore, we want to provide policymakers with support when designing their auctions. So to all the policymakers out there listening to this event, feel free to contact us, to ask questions, to discuss designs with us. And last but not least, we are trying to facilitate the stakeholder exchange. So for example, this event here. And as you can see, we're 11 partners with different backgrounds, consultancies, universities, research institutes. And we will be working on AURIS-2 until the end of April 22, unfortunately. Nevertheless, we are already working on having a successor project, AURIS-3, where we want to expand the view of auctions in other topics, for example, hydrogen or heating and cooling. So stay tuned, subscribe to our newsletter, visit our website, send us questions, emails. And yeah, we are looking forward, I'm especially looking forward to a fruitful discussion during this event. And I give the floor back to you, Fabian, and greetings to Glasgow.
Thank you, Vasily. So we see that overall, around the globe, competitive procurement and auctions are on the rise. By 2020, 116 countries around the world had held auctions for renewable energy. And by the way, since we're in the European pavilion here, almost all countries in the European Union by now have had auctions for renewable energy. What is an auction? There are many types of auctions used around the world, but simplified, we can say that in the past, often rounds of experts have set prices for renewable energy. They were often paid in feed-in tariff. That was great initially when renewable energy was a rather young technology to reduce the risk for investors. But we often saw that the experts were not as fast as markets in foreseeing the falling costs of technologies and changing financing conditions. That's why in an auction, instead, the government sets the volume of power it wants to procure, and the market is providing price. Of course, for this, you have to have sufficient competition. So in an auction, the government calls for tenders, for bidders to offer renewable energy to be produced. And it has often a qualification round where bidders have to prove that they are earnest, that they are building realistic projects, that they are competent enough and solvent enough to build these projects. And then these qualified projects are being ranked by the government. And in the end, the bids are accepted up to the point where renewable energy supply demand by the government has been met. Auctions are particularly important when we're discussing about more ambitious climate action, because in the end, we see that the decarbonization of the power sector, which is progressing often also more fast than other sectors, is not sufficient. Much more effort needs to be undertaken to decarbonize industry, to decarbonize cooling and heating, and to decarbonize the transportation sector. And for all of this, we either will see an increase in electrification, or we will see hydrogen and other measures used, which also need renewable power to function. So in the end, we will see that more ambitious climate action will result necessarily in much higher renewable energy amount of projects to be built and procurements to be undertaken by the government. However, we have a challenge because often climate plans, energy plans, and renewable energy procurement plans in countries are not aligned. And this is a challenge because you have to build up a credible pipeline for investors by announcing auction quotas for the coming years in a country to signal investors it makes sense, you should take money in your hand and pre-develop projects now and do secure land and do site assessments, because it will be needed in a few years from now. So we see that with more ambitious NDCs, also the demand for competitive procurement and for auctions and for higher quotas is increasing. In the ORIS project, we have overall undertaken more than 100 interviews with investors and with developers from all around Europe to identify where are the key risks in renewable energy auctions and projects. We have done that because as renewable energies mature much more and technology prices are going down, financing costs are becoming a key factor often in determining whether countries are achieving low prices in auctions or not. And for that, it was important for us to understand where are the key areas where risks occur and where risk in the project can be also in the process can be taken out. In this, we have seen that there are 4 types of risks. There's the qualification risk, meaning you have to make sure that sufficient bids are qualifying in the auction. If bidders aren't experienced, they might hand in bids where certain elements are missing, or if they don't have sufficient time to prepare for an auction. So the government can usually tackle this by allowing the project developers sufficient time to do site measurements, to obtain certain building permits, and ideally also have a multi-year auction timetable, making sure that if a project is not successful the first time, maybe because it was disqualified, it can apply a year later or 2 years later. A second type of risk we identified in the process is the allocation risk. That is basically the risk that you pre-develop a project, you secure land, you pay for certain site measurements, and then you don't win the auction. So this is then often money you spend, which you don't give back. But of course, if you have an option to participate around 1 year later or 2 years later with the same project, maybe you will be more ambitious and more competitive in your bid next time, but you haven't lost all the money you spent already in the pre-development. So for this allocation risk, we see that often also a multi-year schedule is quite a good way to address this, as well as sufficient budgets. Next one is the non-compliance risk. For this is basically the risk that you might not be able to develop the project on time as in the realization timeline defined by the government. And there can be reasons for that. Maybe you didn't get a certain permit on time, or the grid connection is lagging. And of course that is a risk because often in that case you have to pay a penalty, or at some point you'll be forced to abandon a project. To deal with this risk, you have to make sure that you have realistic expectation in terms of what kind of permits can the developers realistically procure during this time, or how much time does it take to get a certain permit in place or to do certain site measurements. And also we have to make sure that the bidders have sufficient information on this type of permits, and that the permitting process should ideally be lean enough so developers have an opportunity to kind of realistically assess these risks also. And the final risk is the market exposure risk. That's basically the risk in case you have to sell your power on the wholesale market as well and get a premium on top, that of course you have fluctuating revenues. And in that case, there can be certain measurements where the government guarantees a certain minimum payment, for example, through a contract of difference, to ensure that these kind of risks are taken into account and that developers have a more certain revenue stream. So these are kind of risks we identified in our project. A final outlook maybe also is that auctions are, the more they mature and the more countries had kind of first auctions for simple renewable energy projects, system integration and flexibility and sector coupling are becoming much more important. The reason is that you don't want to just procure the cheapest renewable energy project, but then have rather high costs connected to the grid, or you have power produced at certain times we don't need it. But ideally you have a more integrated approach. So therefore we can see currently a trend that countries are taking in their auction design, they're integrating elements to pay power more according to times when it's needed, or at locations where they can still easily integrate into the grid. We also see that flexibility auctions are increasing, where you procure renewables together with storage. And we see that more and more direct sales into wholesale markets are occurring, which also means then that there are new risks coming up, and that bidders have to find a way to deal with these. We also see that we are moving now more towards integrated auctions, where auctions are, where renewable energy projects are auctioned together with PV projects and maybe demand side management, for example, to reduce the need for distribution grid extensions. So all these are really exciting trends we see, also more hydrogen options, but I'm sure also the practitioners later in the session will give you some more ideas about what's happening. So let's come to our first panel session today. These are all experts we have exchanged with for many years and worked with for many years, and I'm really happy to have this really knowledgeable panel with us today. I will actually start with my first question, and this is in terms of challenges you see around the world or in your countries where you operate in for introducing auctions for renewable energy, and best practices. What are ways you've found to address these challenges? Maybe I would start now with Naida from the energy community. Good to have you here.
Thank you.
What were challenges you had to overcome in the countries you worked with in the Balkans and the Caucasus in Eastern Europe, and what are best practices you found?
Thank you. Good evening to everyone from my side, first of all. As Fabian introduced me, my name is Naida Taso, and I'm electricity and renewables expert in the Energy Community Secretariat. For those of you who don't know, it's an international organization based in Vienna, in Austria. And we actually bring together European Union and neighbors trying to create integrated pan-European energy market. Basically, our main goal is to support 9 of our contracting parties, and those are Western Balkan 6 plus Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, to implement the EU energy law and to eventually join the European Union. When it comes to market-based support scheme and auctions, although our contracting parties have not yet transposed and implemented the RED II directive, we are slowly starting with introduction of auctions. So far, we had only 2 countries who introduced auctions and had, I would say, very successful rounds of solar PV auctions, and those are Albania and North Macedonia. The challenges at the moment we are facing actually is, first of all, 2020 targets for renewable energy expired. And unfortunately, we have not yet adopted 2030 targets, which it makes it difficult actually to provide this long-term schedule, which you were mentioning, which should provide security for planning and strategic overview for the investors. So targets are not in place, therefore it's challenging to establish quotas for auctions. And the second challenge I would say we're facing in our contracting parties is actually the fact that we are talking about market-based support scheme and we don't have markets in place. Besides Serbia, none of our contracting parties has a power exchange and day ahead market, and none of them have actually intraday market in place. And this is making challenge to actually select correct mechanism to implement auctions. Of course, intraday market is important in this case for the allocation of balancing responsibility, which is in the end very important to investors as well. In some cases, to overcome these challenges, we actually introduced, especially the second one, which considers the market, we introduced this so-called conversion event, which means that actually bidders are bidding for the fixed purchase price, which will, in certain point in their contract already, be converted to the contract for difference. And the criteria for that is existence of the liquid and operational day-ahead market. A small challenge, I would say, in that sense is now actually to define the criteria for the liquidity of the market on which we are working at the moment. But I have to say it was quite successful, because in Albania we recently, actually this year, had an auction where the price of less than 30 euros per megawatt hour was achieved, and at the year before, just the feed-in tariffs were granted at 3 times higher price.
Wow. Thank you, Naida. Next, I would ask Diala from the International Renewable Energy Agency. I mean, you're working all around the world, so I would be curious to hear your expectations, your experiences with that. Welcome.
Thank you, Fabian. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you, Naida, for this very interesting intervention. So just before I go into auctions globally, just to respond a bit to Naida's intervention, it's and particularly her comment on the targets and the importance of targets. So at IRENA, we always underline the importance of the design of the auction, but we always put it into context of the whole policy framework that is implemented in a country. And I just want to echo the message that Naida gave on the importance of having targets and long-term commitments towards attracting investments. And just a bracket, since we are at COP, at IRENA we analyzed the renewable energy components of NDCs that were submitted at COP, and we see that out of the 194 NDCs that were submitted, we see 142 had specific renewable energy targets in them, 108 of which focus on power. Initially, I mean, the first thought is that we always encourage focusing on end uses beyond power, but currently in IRENA's World Energy Transitions Outlook, in our 1.5 degree scenario, we put a lot of emphasis on electrification of end uses. So this focus on power is actually in line with our vision towards electrification, which you also mentioned, Fabian, sector coupling, and we are welcoming this focus on power, and we see that if 108 countries have a target on power, 48 of them specifically on installed capacities, then we see that this is one step forward towards translating those targets into concrete projects through, for example, auctions. So now that we touched upon the whole enabling, or part of the whole enabling environment for auctions, to just go one step beyond and focus a bit more on auctions. As you rightfully mentioned, Fabian, we look at, in IRENA, we look at auctions. First, we started looking at auctions in a sense of what are the factors that were influencing the prices, because we were looking at price reduction, which was the main outcome or main objective of auctions. And then in 2019, we published a report that goes at that looks at design of auctions beyond price. And as you rightfully mentioned, we share the same interests and objectives. We look at auction design for system integration. We look at auction design to ensure project completion. So all those challenges that you mentioned, we look at how we can design auctions to address those what we call underperformances at every stage of the auction. So we partition we break down the auction into 4 stages. We look at the bidding stage, we look at the contracting stage, and then the project development or construction, and then the operation. And we look at the design elements that can impact underperformance or that can avoid underperformance at every stage. And what was very interesting to see is that one design element that impacts or that let's say avoids underperformance in one stage, for example, the construction, can cause underperformance in another stage, like for example bidding. So in this sense, very strict qualification requirements or bid bonds or completion bonds can have less competition. And the third objective, and this is where I would like to focus this intervention on, is supporting a just and inclusive transition. IRENA puts a lot of emphasis on this, and we look at the socio-economic benefits of renewable energy in details. And in this, I would like to just give 2 examples that we always look at, which are the examples of South Africa and Morocco, where design elements were introduced in auctions to ensure that job creation or the development of projects in specific areas to encourage their economic development, or to encourage also the participation of marginalized people. So those are all also areas that we focus on, and in this sense, those 2 examples are very important. One last thing that I would like to say, and this is what we are looking forward to in the future. This year we are focusing in a regional market analysis on Africa, and we see that in Africa we have seen a lot of auctions happen recently, and we have seen them going all the way up to the contracting stage. Unfortunately, this is where we reach challenges, mainly in reaching financial close. And so in this year we are looking at auction design to look for specifically for high risk environments. So how can we use or leverage at best the support of multilateral banks and development financial institutions, and to what extent can the design elements of auctions, or can the design of an auction help support the reaching the completion stage and the healthy operation of projects. So which brings us back to the whole enabling environment that goes beyond the auction, and this is where I will leave it for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Diala. Next, I would hand over to Adil from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Welcome, Adil.
Right. Thank you very much, Fabian, and a pleasure to be here. Sadly, not in Glasgow myself, but a very good evening to you all. I think some opening remarks from my side, at least. So, working at the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, who work in 38 countries, a range of different types of markets, from Central Asia to Eastern Europe and the Western Balkans, as well as North Africa. So a diversity of markets. Now, for us, auctions have become a priority area. We've been supporting our countries on scaling up renewable energy sources now ever since we started, really, since 1991. And increasingly, auctions are a priority simply because what we have found is that auctions are an effective means to scale up investment in renewable energy sources and to scale up investment at an affordable price. The key, just perhaps to elaborate on that a little bit further, we see auctions as being good for consumers because they have a track record of being able to deliver prices that are very cheap. Some of our own auctions, and for example, the one Naida mentioned, Albania, we've done auctions recently in Uzbekistan. These are some of the cheapest sources of power that we have seen. So they're good for consumers, they're good for policymakers because they give them a degree of control over when to procure, what to procure, and exactly the timing and the transparency of the process. But the final thing that I would turn to is that we find that auctions are actually very effective for industry as well. One of the things that auctions have allowed us to do is to move past this question of what is the right support price for renewable energy sources. Historically, we found that to be one of the critical challenges in the renewable energy sector. Prices were typically set administratively, and there was always this question of, from policymakers, are we paying too much? Are we paying too little? Will we get the investors? And this has led to a variety of issues in the development of renewables. The EU has many countries where we've seen this problem come up, and we've seen this lead to things like retroactive changes in prices. So with auctions, it takes that away. It gives you an objective mechanism to try and determine exactly what the right level of support is. So there are a number of reasons why we have prioritized auctions, and this has led to a support program. We're working right now actively in 14 countries. We've partnered very fruitfully with some of the fellow panelists here, the organizations that they represent. What do we find in our experience? What makes a good auction? It's really the design. You have to. I'd echo the comments made by Diala and by Naida. It's the broader support framework. So the key thing we find is that the auctions need to be anchored within that broader support structure and anchored within the local context. They should not be an isolated support scheme that is completely disjointed and dislocated from the rest of the electricity sector and from the broader electricity sector policy of the particular country. So it starts from there, and then it moves into specific details, some of the things that you mentioned earlier on auction design. I think as a financial institution, perhaps the one that I would focus on is the risk allocation part. It is the fair allocation of risk that ultimately will lead to the investments reaching commercial close, financial close at the end. And fair allocation of risk is not necessarily an allocation of risk whereby you give the investors everything they want. No, it's about, and in fact, most wise investors would not accept that, because what you want is a risk allocation that is sustainable. And so that's something that we would look for as well. So the main item I would say on risk allocation is about attributing risks to those who are best placed to manage those. And that, for us, tends to be where a lot of dialogue happens as part of our technical assistance to countries to figure out exactly what risk should be allocated to which party. And that ultimately is what drives the interest of developers and the interest of the investors who come behind the developers and eventually secure a successful project.
Thank you so much, Adil. And we also have a video statement by Sarah Lawson from USAID. She's currently traveling, so she couldn't be here live, but she recorded her statement, and I think it's very interesting to her perspective as well.
Hello, my name is Sarah Lawson, and I'm on the Global Energy team at the U.S. Agency for International Development. I apologize for having to record my remarks rather than be there in person. USAID is the U.S. government's development agency, and we support our partner countries in reforming their energy sectors and scaling up renewable energy around the world to meet ambitious climate goals. We are particularly proud of our work on renewable energy auctions, sometimes called competitive procurements depending on the country, because we believe in the ability of auctions to transparently scale renewables at affordable prices. USAID design support can range from providing education on auctions to key government stakeholders like the ministry, utility, or regulator, helping create auctions rules and contracts, to structuring the auctions rounds and engaging the private sector. We have provided support to auction design from Colombia and Mexico to India, Kazakhstan, Senegal, and Zambia. I would like to send a big congratulations to the Colombian government on their most recent auction, where they awarded 800 megawatts of solar power last week. Countries face many challenges in increasing the renewable energy deployment. By far the biggest one I see is fear and uncertainty about wind and solar and how they will affect system operations. It is generally possible to manage up to 20% renewable energy penetration on your system without making major investments in grid infrastructure, and instead focusing on policy and behavioral shifts. Strategic planning with a view towards building a climate resilient system is a necessity, as is understanding the renewable resources in your country, which locations they are in, how to transmit them to where power is needed at least cost, and where transmission is even available. However, as we add more and more renewables, grid modernization and upgrades will become more important, and there will be associated costs. The renewable energy transition will also create pressures on local and indigenous communities who are nearby all these resources. So consulting and sharing benefits will be critical to successful project development and to reduce delays. We have a forthcoming paper on this topic that we hope you will review. These challenges are all surmountable, and they can be managed through an auction design process that prioritizes consultation, planning, and is tailored to your country's specific needs, whether they be job creation, quickly getting power online after a drought, or reaching your NDC. I believe auctions can be faster processes than trying to conclude projects bilaterally, which takes up valuable government time. And I hope you will consider performing an auction in your country if you have not already. Thank you, and I look forward to an excellent program today.
Thank you, Sarah. Now we will have an interactive session with the audience, and for that one I hand over to our moderator in Berlin, Anna, who will lead you through our case study.
Thank you, Fabian, and happy to join you. Also, my name is Anna Amaso, also part of the Guidehouse team, and I'm joining from Berlin, Germany. Now we will do a little bit of role playing. For the case study, we ask you, the audience, to imagine you are all auction designers in a fictitious country implementing auctions for the first time. Your job is to choose the right design for your auction considering the following country characteristics. First, you know your country urgently needs additional renewable capacity to ensure security of supply. Also, you know the transmission grid built or planned lags behind the renewable energy capacities added. Let's go now to our Slido poll. And remember, you need to be need to imagine you are the auctioneer in this country. The first question, we ask you to please select the appropriate design element for the auction's volume and schedule. Can we share some of the polls results?
Oh, we see them. So far, everything is 100%.
Perfect. Okay.
Well,
it seems you have all been attentively listening to what our wonderful speakers have been telling you about auctions. So let's move now into our second question, please. For this one, we ask you to select whether for your country it is appropriate to have project location constraints, meaning in the form of how much capacity should be connected to a node or region. Please select one of the two options. Okay, in this one we see, okay, people are still voting. The vote is a little bit more split than in the previous one, but ultimately the majority is of the opinion that there should be a capacity limit on substations. Thank you for that. Now, for the second case study, I will ask you to imagine you are, instead of an auctioneer, an investor, and you are thinking of entering a new country that has announced a solar PV auction. Your job is to assess which risks might be present in this country, considering its market and regulatory conditions. It's going to be a bit of more detail, but bear with me. So you know from this new country that the auction was announced in advance and that bidders have 1 year to obtain all required permits and conduct their on-site solar measurements. They also have high-quality solar maps. Second, you know that there are 400 megawatts of potential solar projects in the pipeline, but the announced auction volume is actually 80 megawatts. Also, there is no schedule nor future auctions announced. Third, you know that permitting authorities typically grant permits quickly, and there are also great studies identifying how much capacity are available at the different nodes of the grid. And lastly, you know that successful bidders will receive a fixed premium, meaning a premium that will stay constant throughout the duration of the PPA, and that will be paid on top of the wholesale market revenues that producers receive. This country has a wholesale market, but it is not yet liquid, although it is expected that it will become liquid soon. Let's move to our poll. From the risks that Fabian introduced, which ones do you think are present in this country announcing solar PV auctions? You can choose more than one option. Is it the qualification risk, meaning that bidders prepare but still are disqualified from participating in the auction? Is it rather the allocation risk, in which they participate but they are very low chances of being awarded? Is it the non-compliance risk, meaning that they will face penalties because perhaps they don't build the project on time? Or is it rather the market exposure risks, because a lot of the project revenue is exposed to volatile electricity market prices throughout the duration of the contract? I see there's some movement. And Fabian, it seems our audience has been attentively listening to what our speakers have been saying. A lot of consensus in terms of the allocation risk and market exposure risks. And I would like to thank you, our audience, for participating. And let's hear now from our experts. Back to you, Fabian.
Thank you so much, Anna. And I suggest, first of all, wonderful results. I think also virtually, thanks for your participation. And I have to say, you are more aware on some of these issues than some policymakers are. So congratulations for that. Hopefully you are the policymakers also. I would like to combine the second and third panel. And I would like to, if you have any comments on the case studies, feel free to mention them. But I would particularly like to look into the coming years a bit and to see what's going to happen with competitive procurement and auctions, what are going to be the most important developments. And I think for that, before I go to the panelists list of our previous panel, maybe we have a special guest today from Google, Devin. I'll be very interested to hear a bit about what you think from the corporate side, because you are participating, you also are giving out auctions, you are a market player, you are a consumer, a lot of roles you're playing, and I would really like to hear a bit your view on the regulation side, but also on the technology side. What's going to be next?
Yeah, well, thank you, Fabian, for the invitation and the Guidehouse team for putting on this event. I think it's a really fantastic project, the ARIS project, and what I'd say at the outset is that we're really excited to see this move across the world to renewable energy auctions that focus on driving down the cost of renewable energy to levels that are competitive in the market and sort of away from the feed-in tariff systems of the past, which, as you mentioned, were very helpful at the time in driving deployment volumes. But now that clean energy really is the cheapest form of energy in many markets around the world, these auction mechanisms are really great tools to drive deployment at greater scale, which is what we need to achieve climate goals. So I might start just by orienting everyone to sort of, I guess, Google's role in this conversation, which is that we are a large electricity consumer around the world, active in many different markets through our data center portfolio, now across 10 different countries on 4 different continents. And we're also one of the largest buyers of renewable energy, non-utility buyers of renewable energy in the world. We've signed 6 gigawatts of clean energy power purchase agreements for wind and solar projects across the world. And in 2017, we achieved a goal since 2017 and every year since then that people refer to as 100% renewable energy, which means that we purchase on an annual basis across the globe the same amount of megawatt hours of renewable electricity as we consume globally. But we realized that that was really not enough. It's a really important milestone on the path to the ultimate objective that we set for ourselves last year, which is to operate on 24/7 carbon-free energy in every location where we have facilities around the globe by 2030. And so one of the speakers spoke a little bit about the time and location elements of auctions being important. For us, you can kind of think about it as us zooming in from this global annual view towards a view where time and location is really critical, because what we're trying to do is decarbonize our hourly electricity consumption. And so one of the things I'd mention is that corporate buyers like Google and many others, we want to play the role of adding incremental new clean energy capacity onto the grid. And that's one of the reasons Google has used these power purchase agreements, where we sign a fixed price agreement for an asset over a period of, let's say, 10 or 20 years that allows that project to get built and become new onto the grid. And last year, actually, companies signed 24 gigawatts of renewable energy PPAs across the world, which is a new record. And it looks like there's going to be another record set this year as well. And just yesterday, there was an announcement that the US State Department made with companies, including Google, to create something called the Clean Energy Demand Initiative, which is working to scale this type of purchasing with PPAs to many more markets around the world, including some of those where it's not technically possible to do this today. And so the first thing I'd mention is that as policymakers think about auction design, they should also be thinking about how do we ensure that auctions also coexist with a vibrant private market for clean energy at competitive prices, so that buyers like Google and others can come in and purchase clean energy in ways that add new clean power capacity to the grid, and that also help relieve some of the public budget that's necessary to provide subsidy support for clean energy. And then finally, one of the things that I think is an innovation that we are pushing forward and expecting to see more of going forward is a move beyond the corporate PPA model, which, as I mentioned, has been incredibly important and will remain so, to a model where we think about how do we actually combine different technologies together to more cost effectively and fully decarbonize hourly electricity consumption. So instead of signing just a PPA for wind power, although we will need a lot more wind power, and instead of signing just a PPA for solar, although we need a lot more solar, we need structures that can combine technologies like wind, like solar, like battery storage, and other firm or non-variable clean energy technologies to really drive grid decarbonization as quickly as possible. And this is a model that we have scaled or that we have created both in the United States with a partner named AES in Virginia, and also with ENGIE in Europe here in Germany, where we have basically created these types of supply portfolios to bring multiple clean energy technologies onto the grid at once to enable us to get more of an hourly decarbonization of our electricity consumption. So I think auction planners and policymakers could also be thinking about this with respect to how do we design auctions to not just deploy one technology, but to bring multiple technologies together to drive decarbonization as quickly as possible.
Thank you so much. Maybe handing next over to Adil. What is your take? Where do you see the the auctions, the market developing in which field?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, I think Devon has taken the words out of my mouth. I think those and it's heartening to see that the corporate sector is thinking about the same types of issues that we find ourselves talking to policymakers about. Precisely the corporate PPA market is one that is very interesting from our perspective as well. It helps to diversify the counterparty risk, which is something we'd always be looking to do. And indeed, one of the things that we've seen, just to step back for a moment, as we've seen electricity prices come down, auctions are not necessarily there to provide subsidies, but rather to provide a degree of stability on revenues. And what we've seen policymakers do is to take that part and to come up with some structures which invite private sectors, corporate PPAs, as well as centralized support schemes. So take the Albania example that Dela mentioned earlier. That's a project that is 50% merchant and 50% supported. So there is a support component that covers a guaranteed offtake, but then the rest of the power is being sold through the electricity market, and the most effective way of doing that is through the corporate PPA market. Serbia is a country that's trying to look at a similar sort of model, and indeed it's this model that we think there is a lot of growth for. Egypt right now, it's looking at that particular issue as well. So I'd echo that. I think the corporate PPA market is certainly an important development, and to see how that operates alongside the auctions that are being run by policymakers. And the key to that really is the electricity market development. So being able to try and work on the electricity market development and not have renewables necessarily operate in a parallel universe, but rather to operate within the electricity system and the electricity market in particular. And the second point, again, I'd echo that. The idea is, we know that there is a massive challenge that we face in reaching that decarbonized power system. We know that these decarbonized power systems are going to have something like 70 to 80% intermittent renewable energy sources. The integration of those sources is the key challenge. And that's going to require a variety of solutions. It's going to include demand-side management. It's going to include battery storage. It's going to include being able to optimize across different sources of technology. And you'd like to figure out a way in which auctions are being able to capture this. Part of that will come through the electricity market, but part of that might come through clever auction design. So those are the sort of things we're looking at. We have seen people, Chile, I think, run around-the-clock auction. India has run an auction, which is something like around-the-clock auction. Germany recently ran an auction that was a hybrid, which saw solar PV with battery storage. It's those things that we see actually as the sort of future of auctions, for them to become more and more intelligent as we go along, and to think increasingly about that integration challenge, which is partly an auction issue and partly a much wider issue that needs to be worked alongside it. So certainly I think those two thoughts that came out previously, I'd echo those, and hopefully you can see that it's things that people certainly in the policymaker side are thinking about, and on the investor side are thinking about.
Thank you, Adil. Next to Diala from the arena.
Yes, I fully agree with Adil. The points that he made, we are actually in full agreement. When I mentioned before the study that we did on auction design to support system integration, these are exactly the things we looked at. I mean, this is a beautiful feature of auctions, and this is what makes them so interesting to talk about for days. The way that they can be designed in a way to capture all these, we looked at from the way that we classify them from the aspect of auction demand, whether it's about combining technologies and make it a hybrid auction, or whether it's about specifying the demand bands in terms of the time of the day of production, or whether we can go to qualification requirements and impose locations closer to the grid, or we can select based on winner selection criteria that are at proximity to the grid or the time also of production, and all the way to the way we, which is our fourth category of design elements, which is how we allocate the risks among among the different players and how much we allocate risk of production on the off-taker or on the producer. So this is in the sense of system integration. But just before I leave you with one last thought at IRENA, we also look at auctions beyond renewable energy procurement because we look at it from a whole systems perspective. We are interested in auctions for green hydrogen. This is going to be the next thing we look at. And we are also interested in some cases. For example, we saw Germany auctioned the phasing out of some coal plants. This is something that also interests us, and this is where we're going to be looking next. Thank you.
Super exciting. Thank you, Diala. Now, Naida, what do you think? What is happening in your region? What's going to be next?
Thanks, Fabian. And we've been working for a while already with Diala and IRENA and Adil in DBRD, so we have a quite aligned views, I would say. I would like just to emphasize and echo what Adil said about providing support to the part of the capacity. So this is what we've seen happening in our region, in Albania, as I mentioned already, successful auctions for solar PV, but also now in newly adopted renewables law in Serbia. This is something which could partially solve this allocation risk from the case study that was mentioned before. And it was great to hear actually from Devon and from Google, because as Clean Energy Package says, consumers are in the center of the energy transition. So this is a very important aspect. From our side, I would say, of course, we are working on introduction of corporate PPAs in our region, but also maybe to mention one another important aspect which we are focusing on, and those are the guarantees of origin, which we call in the Europe, but green certificates, which actually prove that a certain amount of electricity is produced from renewable energy. I think this is important in the context of this Renewable 100 and broader companies which actually want to use electricity from renewables. And maybe just in the end to say, I would say there is no perfect recipe for each country. You need to design mechanism which will serve best your needs and your framework and your market situation.
Thank you so much, Naida. Now also Sarah Lost from USAID recorded some final thoughts on the future of auctions and renewable support in her video. So we're also going to look at that one.
We face enormous challenges in reaching net zero. I am excited by the dynamism that we see in energy auctions. South Africa is expected to soon announce the results of its most recent REAP round, Africa's longest running auctions program. From countries planning wind and solar procurements for the first time in Eastern Europe, to experienced countries like India rolling out round-the-clock auctions that involve system integration and energy storage, countries using multi-technology portfolios like Chile, time blocks in Colombia, flexibility auctions and products in Kazakhstan, we are seeing more sophistication and innovation, which will be needed as we begin to depend on renewables, not only in the power sector, but also in transport, industry, and buildings. Corporate procurement will also be key as companies green their industrial and commercial sectors, and we recently saw the opportunity for companies to directly purchase power in Vietnam. We would like to be your country's partner in the energy transition. If you are interested in working with USAID on your energy sector priorities, please feel free to send me an email, Sarah Lawson, SLAWSON, @usaid.gov. Thank you to my fellow panelists and organizers, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you so much. Let me conclude with a few last remarks. Those wonderful statements from the different participants who work in very different markets actually, but it's interesting to see that there are some best practices I think we most of us can agree on. These are the importance of long-term targets to give developers a clear pipeline of projects. Another one is the importance that you really tailor your auction scheme, your procurement scheme to the local regulatory and market conditions. The importance that there is a fair risk sharing between developers and the government, and the importance to take into account local stakeholders and communities. We also saw that there are a couple of really exciting trends to look forward to in the coming years or months, or they're happening now. Corporate procurement basically is on the rise a lot. With that also guarantees of origin and the importance to better trace the renewables generated. Then the idea of at some point auctions and PPAs not so much serving to distribute support costs, but rather to support kind of a fallback revenue stabilization mechanism. I think that's really interesting. We see the trend to sell power more directly at wholesale markets, to not to have two separate systems, but to integrate them, and the discussions that come with that. And then we see the idea to have a more systematic approach on this, right? And to think more about integrated auctions and auctions for green hydrogen and others. Super exciting things to look forward to on our ORIS2 project website, of course, but also on all the websites and reports of the organizations here. And thank you so much for bearing with us tonight, quite late. Thank you also for the international audience online. And yeah, if you have any questions, contact us now, later. Looking forward to it. Thank you.